Well, Sergey, thank you so much for the introduction. I was so pleased when Sergey invited me to talk at your webinar, which is currently in celebration of the 150th anniversary of Darwin's The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And I'm going to start sharing my screen here. But also, if I, let's see, is that going to work? I think so. I also want to, let's see, say that my eagerness to say yes was partly prompted by a review in Science that two of the organizers were co-authors on, Sergey and Pete, as well as Frans de Waal, in celebration of the 150th anniversary of this, one of Darwin's masterworks. And the argument that they made in their review was that Darwin was so prescient in recognizing the importance of cultural group selection. And since my reading of the same text is quite different, I was delighted to have a chance to put on the table an alternative and see how the kinds of holes you want to poke in it. My reading of Darwin includes the part of the text which is often quoted by people who want to say, see, he saw that cultural group selection is such an important force. And here he is saying, when two tribes of primeval man living in the same country came into competition, if one tribe included a greater number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members, this tribe would without doubt succeed best to conquer the other. But in the course of time, it would be overcome by some other still more highly endowed tribe. Thus, the social and moral qualities would tend slowly to advance and be diffused throughout the world. So he lays that out. It's often quoted by people who want to cite Darwin for seeing the importance of cultural group selection. But he goes, and especially because he goes on to say, but it may be asked, how did a large number of members first become endowed with these social and moral qualities? And how was the standard of excellence raised? He was ready to sacrifice his life rather than betray his comrades, would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature. The bravest men who were always willing to the front in war and who freely risked their lives for others would on average perish in larger numbers than others. Therefore, it seems scarcely possible that the number of men gifted with such virtues or that the standard of their excellence could be increased through natural selection. So he has set the challenge. And then my reading is he goes on to meet the challenge he has set. He says, we can trace some of the probable steps. And the thing I want to emphasize is this: another much more powerful stimulus to the development of the social virtues, namely the praise and blame of our fellow men, the love of approbation, the dread of infamy, as well as the bestowal of praise or blame, which no doubt was originally acquired through natural selection. My reading of Darwin also highlights how in the Origin, he defined natural selection this way. Of course, as you all know, individuals having any advantage, however slight, over others would have the best chance of surviving and procreating their kind. Any variation in least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations I call natural selection. And I see him already in that definition recognizing trade-offs. Procreating and surviving often require trading off some of the costs to survival for procreation. And it was also in the Origin that he defined what he called sexual selection. It depends not on the struggle for existence, but on a struggle between the males for possession of the females. The result is not death to the unsuccessful competitor, but few or no offspring. He also, in the origin, recognized what we've come to call the Fischer condition. We call it that because it was actually Fischer's contribution to the modern synthesis, recognizing that what happens over time to populations is a demographic thing, and we put together natural selection plus Mendelian inheritance. It's so amazing what Darwin was able to see when he didn't understand inheritance. And Fischer pointed this out. Consider the aggregate of an entire generation. Each sex must supply half the ancestry of all future generations of the species. That's the Fischer condition. If we're talking diploids, one mother, one father for everybody. And so this accounts for why for diploids, for example, us, offspring sex ratio is normally very close to 50-50. And it also explains why sometimes it can be highly biased. No time to talk about that, but it also explains why mating sex ratios have important effects on reproductive strategies. My collaborators and I elaborated the grandmother hypothesis to account for these very distinctive features of our life history. The fact that there are all these postmenopausal women like me running around, postmenopausal longevity, the fact that we mature later, and yet we have much shorter birth intervals than the other living hominids, our closest living cousins, the great apes. Now, although no time to talk about it, now we see that actually longevity can explain our bigger brains and especially our really big neocortex, that our early weaning can explain our social appetites, why I'm doing this, and I hope you are tracking at least some of what I'm saying. But what I focus on today is sexual selection. Again, in honor of the anniversary and its consequences. Male mating competition, that can explain our pair bonding habits, and the archaeological record of carnivory, which has preoccupied Paleolithic archaeologists. So this is our genealogy, in a sense, the relationship between us and the other living hominids, the great apes. And a striking feature of all of them is that mothering is an independent thing. Babies are with their moms, and in fact, they are already starting to feed themselves while they are nursing. She's a working mom moving through the forest, feeding herself. Babies begin to do that in chimpanzees and gorillas within the first year. In orangutans, it's a little after the first year, but beginning while they're still depending on mother's milk, and then when they're weaned, they entirely feed themselves. And yet that is not the way it is in us. And the recognition of another feature that seems to distinguish us from them is the basis for what I'm going to call the hunting hypothesis. It's widely known as that, and it has a deep history, but it especially was elaborated by Sherwood Washburn so persuasively in the middle of the 20th century. And I'm using this Hadza couple and their baby because I'm going to take advantage of our Hadza ethnography as one of the lines of evidence I want to lay before you. And there she is with the baby, and there he is with his tools. And the notion is that what happened in our lineage was that males brought home the bacon to feed their mates and offspring. And that was the beginning of a whole array of things that distinguish us and that characterize our hominin lineage, or many of the taxa within it. Glyn Isaac was a very influential archaeologist who at the end of the 70s published a paper which is still very widely cited suggesting, well, actually asserting that the archaeological record that we have shows by about 2 million years ago, maybe a little later than that, we have evidence of this process in which the inference is it's males bringing home the bacon to a home base to subsidize their mates and offspring. And it was interpreted as archaeological support for the hunting hypothesis I was just talking about. But at about the same time, another archaeologist, also extremely influential, Lou Binford, made at the length of a book a very counter argument to Isaac and criticized him specifically and explicitly, pointing out, you look at these early assemblages, boy, you can't tell whether, and things will be different if those things are the result of tool using bipeds, or if the result of carnivores who are doing things with their jaws and dragging and so on. You can't tell whether these are transported assemblages or near kill. You can't tell apart whether what's going on is scavenging from carnivores or actual hunting. It looks to me, said Binford, like consumption is at the place of procurement. And there is no evidence supporting the argument that the hominids at Olduvai Gorge were hunting. No evidence for base camps exists. So this was all in the air when Nick Blurton-Jones invited Jim O'Connell and me to join a project in which we would, if Hadza folks would let us, we would hang out, we would time measure, try to systematically follow both how people were spending their time, what they got for it, a particularly interesting ethnographic opportunity for reasons that I can't detail. Nick had different questions in mind than Jim did. I had different questions in mind brought here by what we'd found in the Aceh project, but it's an especially interesting part of the world because here are these folks in the neighborhood just south of Lake Eyasi in the Rift Valley of East Africa, for which there's such a deep record of our ancestral occupation. Olduvai Gorge is right over there. Laetoli is just across the lake. And we are talking modern people, of course, just as smart as we are, bipedal tool users in a situation where it is also the case that there are carnivores competing for the same stuff. And O'Connell was especially interested in what can we see about how these faunal assemblages form by watching them be formed and then understand how that works. So he monitored every single big animal, watching what happened at the butchering stands, at places where there was a kill, things are taken apart. People all come to eat at the kill, carry stuff away, but what's left? Then what do you see at base camps, at residential bases? Recording what the character of the assemblage is and associating it with the observable behavior in this case. And there is a third kind of site which came to be so important, and there it was in the Hadza data. In the dry season, these guys use hunting blinds to do the same thing the carnivores do. The ungulates have to come to drink. It's quite an opportunity for predators to take advantage of that. And this is a place where multiple carcasses have been butchered. And these are places where Hadza would never camp. It's way too dangerous. And we took a sample from about a 10-meter square part of one of these sites, and Karen Lupo analyzed what she could make of the fauna there. There were more than 11 individual animals, and here O'Connell is putting together the character of the assemblage and comparing it to what we see at these much older sites. the composition of the assemblage, as well as the ecological context. These are all in wet spots, seasonal, perennial springs, etc. Places which would be dry season aggregations for ungulates to come to a dangerous place, but they need to drink, and carnivore predators take advantage of that. And in that paper noted there's a sharp increase in the evidence of hominine exploitation of these large carcasses after about 1.9 million years ago. Well, here we are looking at modern people. They are hunting, they are aggressively scavenging, they take big carcasses away from the carnivores. They're using these powerful bows and arrows, and these guys are all sitting on this giraffe carcass, but they don't hunt as a group. It is usually one guy who's off encounter hunting, sometimes two just for company, usually a single guy looking for a chance to strike a large animal. And if one is well struck, then others will join in the tracking, and at the kill, everybody will come and join in claiming shares. And so what we saw, and again, because O'Connell was every single animal that was taken, and we were monitoring daily activities of everybody, we were able to calculate that the actual chance of a guy on any day capturing one of these large carcasses is way less than 5%. And when he is lucky, and boy, everybody knows, most of the shares are claimed by other people. It is a bonanza for all. And Hadza folks say it's the people's meat. And they come to be sure they're included. That's a real contrast between, well, maybe I need to say first, that's no way to feed the hungry kids, right? The kids have to eat every day. And I pointed out quickly in passing that when we look at our great ape cousins, the babies are already starting to feed themselves, and then they become independent feeders at weaning. And our kids have to eat every day too. And yet what's going on with the hunters is not supplying a regular, reliable daily income that would cover the action, let alone lead to the kind of life history shift that we see in our radiation. Kids have to eat every day. So what goes on with the Hadza? Well, there we can see little kids are trying to get at what is the year-round staple, these deeply buried tubers, but they're too little to be very efficient at it. And so they have to depend on their moms. And we were weighing people, and I wish we'd done more of it. We had a small sample, but we could see even in that small sample how kids were growing better depending on their mother's foraging. We could see that dependence until mom has a newborn, as this woman in the photograph in the lower right does. There's the baby, she's still foraging. There's her, an older child of hers, but she's got the baby. So it is affecting her the time she actually spends foraging. And then in the weights, what we saw was the dependence of the weaned kids on their grandmother's foraging. Now, initially, again, this was a small sample, but Nick, because he did all the hard work of trying to pull together the demography, has shown in his book, published finally in 2016, shown these survival effects that grandmothers have on kids. Now, this contrast I want to highlight is associated with the foods that are being exploited. So those little chimpanzees, for example, there it is fruits and leaves and so on, things that you acquire hand to mouth. These savanna foods are really very unlike that. Little kids can't do it to begin with. Adults get these reliable daily rates, seasonally, all year round. You do better as a forager to do it in batches because your rate goes up as you sort of open that up, the first one, and then the next one, you don't spend as much, and you have this kind of gain curve. And so what we are seeing is that older women add to the batches but they're not adding babies. They're not adding new mouths and new little hands to consume. They are actually subsidizing the women who are still fertile, who can therefore move on and have the next baby sooner. And so we have a very different hypothesis about what would lie behind the life history shifts that we see in our lineage. And when we look at the age structure, so here are models of the age structure of chimpanzees. Just the female half is all I'm showing here. Fertility ends at about the same age in us as it does in them. And each of these bars is a 5-year age class, the fraction of the population, of the female population in that age class. And the green bars are the fertile ages, and the orange bars are the juveniles, still have not yet reached adulthood, are not pumping out babies themselves. But it's over here with the humans, using Hadza to represent us, where we've got all these golden years. We've got these older postmenopausal females whose contribution in our data was clearly making a difference. And at the same time, I was lucky enough, so I had begun as a kind of garden variety cultural anthropologist. I was becoming more intrigued by what the biological tools would do. And especially I was learning from Eric Charnob, who I would say I did a kind of endless postdoc under, who was a theoretical biologist at Utah at the time. He was working on trying to explain the wide variation in life history across the vertebrates. And his model for mammals is the one I'm going to talk about. His 1993 book included this figure. He talks about a model which he had developed and which led to the book, in which it is adult lifespans, adult mortality that drive other features of life history. And in this figure, this was 93, and it was a time when we sort of put all the apes over there, there's somebody else, and then there's us, the hominids. That's changed now, but at the time, he used data from Harvey and Cluttenbrock's compendium and showing the relationship between age of maturity and average female adult lifespan, and showing this regularity that he talked about as approximately invariant. And those 2 points, the one for the other great apes and the one for us, are right there, essentially on the regression. In fact, this actually, Kung-speaking foragers were the basis for Harvey and Cluttenbrock's data set, but humans almost anchor the regression. Well, that would make sense if the postmenopausal females were contributing to the production of descendants, even though they have, quote, no reproductive value. And so a few years later, we took what was the best data at the time and looked at this product, the alpha M product, for the other great apes and for foraging humans. And wow, look at that. Those are essentially the same. But he also, in addition to this alpha M approximate invariant, had also identified what he called an alpha B invariant. And that was that, paradoxically maybe, as lifespans are longer, you can afford to wait longer, get bigger before you stop and have babies. And what is associated with that is producing babies at a slower rate. So the alpha B product goes in the other direction. Well, is that the case? We see grandmother's fingerprints right there. We calculated that for the same populations. And while the other apes, we can see what the alpha B is, for humans, our much shorter birth intervals mean that we stand out. Grandmother's fingerprints would have been our argument. And so persuasive, but could it really happen that way? And we were so lucky to have Peter Kim, a mathematical biologist, get interested in this question. He's now at the University of Sydney. Well, Rick's models, Charnob's models, were all about females. Well, Peter Kim took the grandmother hypothesis that we were talking about, using Charnov's recognition of these relationships, and built an agent-based model to simulate grandmother effects and see whether or not would evolution really do that. And this is a figure from the 2014 paper showing what happens with his simulation. So without grandmothering subsidies on the left, what happens is average adult lifespan stays essentially the same. There are some extinctions, those are interesting. We're starting to see what the boys, some of the effect of the boys. But then if it is the case that older females whose fertility is ending subsidize the still dependent juveniles, then what happens on the left is if they escape the basin of attraction, what happens is they move to a different longevity, all this postmenopausal longevity, to a point that's very like what we see with living people who are under mortality regimes of hunting and gathering. And then Ted Coxworth in the lead took Peter's model and instead of tracking longevity, tracked what happens to the sex ratio in the fertile ages. So reproductive physiology in mammals has this interesting quality that females have all the oocytes early in life, and that's a finite stock, and they start to lose them. We lose most of them actually before birth. We have the maximum 5-month-old fetus, lose them, keep losing them before menarche, whether we're pregnant, whether we're lactating, they're just going away. Boys, on the other hand, continue to produce new sperm throughout adulthood. They are still fertile. And so tracking what's happening to the sex ratio in the fertile ages is what these figures show. And the model values are in the lower left. And of course, this is parameterized by the living world. So it's not surprising that when we do a reality check, what we see is, well, yes. If we look at chimpanzees, what we see is that among the fertile adults, it is a minority that are male. In the human examples, all living people, of course, but among these foragers where we have good demographic data, now these are male biased. And so coming back to the Fischer condition, as many have recently, to recognize what's actually been in the literature for a long time, that if the sex ratio is male biased in the mating ages, what that means is there are all those competitors out there, and males do better once they get a female to guard their control over her. And Ryan Schacht and Adrian Bell built a model addressing this question in 2016 and looked to see if we considered 3 alternative things that males could prioritize. They could either care for their offspring, or they could guard their mate, or they could, having mated, move on to another mate and continue to multiply mate, which is the pattern widely in the mammals. And their model showed that as long as the contribution that care made to the survival of offspring wasn't very great, paternal care had no chance. And everything changed when the sex ratio went from female biased, if there are a lot of opportunities out there, go to the next one, to guard if there aren't, and there are a lot of competitors out there. And they also showed that if you made paternal care so advantageous that the kids who got it could not die, even then, although paternal care worked for a while, as long as the sex ratio got male biased enough, it was still the case that guarding was the winning strategy. And Sarah Liu, who was a graduate student and then postdoc with Peter Kim, took apart some of the assumptions that we might want to consider in models like this. And she showed that if you made it the case that the guarder was trying, but still not perfectly guarding his paternity, losing a few. It didn't take very much of that for the sex ratio to really have to be pretty male biased for guarding to take over. But again, if it gets male biased enough, then guarding takes over. And it showed that whether a male can successfully pull off the guarding is hugely important. And then Sarah went on to consider, what about cases like an analog of what we see in living people, that what males are doing to compete for their position in the social hierarchy, to show I'm somebody you want as an ally, and you don't want me as a hostile objector to you. How males display the qualities that make them desirable as an ally. If that is something that provides benefits to everybody, which is what we see with hunting big animals, then what happens, the figures here show the reputational increment to make your paternity chances higher. That's what is alpha in her models. And it shows that, well, this thing that is beneficial to all, depending on where you start, that's really hard to break. And the paternal caring thing can still do okay. But if the benefits that's applied to all gets great enough, then the space for this paternal care equilibrium gets tinier and tinier. So this thing about what you pull off as your reputation. I'm interpreting these lines of evidence, including the model, to underline what, in a sense, we already know. Hunting reputations matter. We know this where we have ethnography that speaks to it. We know it for the Ache. We know it in the case of the Hadza for Nick's exploration in his 2016 book. Here again are these guys, again, using their upper Paleolithic tools. 322 observation days were tabulated in O'Connell's, in our 2002 paper. O'Connell was the first author on. 322 observation days. Lions and hyenas were still on 18 of the 19 large carcasses when the Hadza drove them off. I mean, Woodburn, who was an ethnographer of the Hadza in the 50s, talked about how, big animals are obvious when they're dead, obvious to everybody, or dying because of the circling birds, like a used car lot. Come here, there's something of interest. So here are these guys with this technology that we can't take very far back into the past, competing with these carnivores. But it's also the case that not only did the ancestral populations not have that technology, the carnivore guild, oh my God, was really terrifying. And this is a table from Blair von Valkenburg's chapter in a 2001 book, in which she's showing the body estimates of these large carnivores in the East African Pleistocene ecology. Lions are the big cats now, but there were others as big and more of them. And as she says, the price of entering the dog-eat-dog world of the carnivore, I can't quite even see my own slide, I hope you can, was undoubtedly high. The rewards must have been substantial. And so O'Connell and I are now pointing to the timing of the beginning of this archaeological record of interaction between tool-using hominines and these carnivores, that after about 2 million years ago, that's when we begin to see this. And that is, if the life history shift was beginning before that, that is very likely, or we can kind of finger match this, and depending on our assumptions, when the Fischer condition kicks in a new way, it kicks in a way that as the sex ratio in the fertile ages becomes male biased, then being able to get your paternity competitors to defer to your proprietary mating claims is the crucial way to increase the chances that you will leave descendants. And intimidating, dangerous carnivores, something that there is an audience for, would then, your fitness is on the line, be worth the risk. And boy, dangerous. Why risk that harm? Not before. And actually, this thing about the role that male attitudes toward each other play in what we see in mating strategies in modern people, recognized by Jane Collier, a cultural anthropologist, who would not be a fan of using biological tools, but there she is, recognizing, looking across ethnography, relations between spouses are best understood in the context of relations between men. Men must assert claims to women in competition with other men. So going back to what Darwin said about this, I'm quoting from him again, through natural selection, those individuals which generated or nourished their offspring best would leave ceteris paribus the greatest number to inherit their superiority. In other cases, sexual selection must have come into action. And that meant it wasn't making males better fitted to survive in the struggle for existence, or nourishing their offspring, I would add parenthetically, but giving them an advantage over other males. It was the importance of this distinction which led me to designate this form of selection as sexual selection. That weapons of offense, means of defense possessed by the males, their courage and pugnacity, I like that characterization, are the result of sexual selection is clear, as unarmed males would succeed equally well in the battle for life and in leaving numerous progeny if better endowed males were not present. So here is Darwin arguing in this very important contribution 150 years ago that sexual selection played an enormous role in our evolution. And I think as lines of evidence now begin to highlight so many of these features, once again, his prescience as about so many things is astonishing, given what he didn't know. So our grandmothering life history. Now we have lines of evidence that suggest it was longevity that gave us our big brains and big neocortex, that increasing longevity, that early weaning, especially in that context, gave us these social appetites starting in infancy that make our connection with others the most important thing in our understanding of the world. But here I've talked about these things. The male bias mating sex ratio, that is the kind of thing that makes mate guarding the advantageous strategy for males. And that's when the sex ratio became male bias. That's when these dangerous carnivores with big carnivores, dangerous contests with big carnivores, where the guys who got in there and did it displayed Darwin's words, courage and pugnacity. Others would, okay, that's a guy who I want on my side, I don't want to cross him. If so, then the early archaeology is a record of male mating competition. So that isn't as much as I would like to put on the table, but it's a lot. And so I, of course, am eager to hear what you think of both the lines of evidence, that interpretation of them, and the ways the pieces fit together, especially in the context of this 150th anniversary of Darwin's Descent of Man.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kristen. fantastic talk, very thought-provoking. What we're going to do is just say that if people want to ask questions, please post them in the Q&A. First of all, we'll go to questions in the Q&A, and then we also have our panelists who may want to put their hands up and ask questions in a minute or so as well. Do you want to stop sharing your screen, Kristen? I can see you. Fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, so we'll turn to our first question, which is from Burton Voorhees, who asks, to what extent do the younger girls also contribute to both food acquisition and care of their younger siblings? That is, complementing the grandmothers, are there babysitters? It strikes me that particularly in patrilocal groups, this would be a way for young women to integrate themselves into female support hierarchies.
So the question is, how much are girls doing? One of the things that astonished me in the beginning with our Hadza project was seeing how early this bifurcation, what the little boys were doing and what the little girls were doing, emerged so early in life. The little boys off with the other boys, the little girls more often staying with their moms and often with others. You don't have to have a baby yourself to be carrying a baby around, and little girls carrying babies, little girls tending in a sense or with younger girls, and all of them together, often foraging near camp. And in fact, when we looked at the return rates that little kids got, as well as adults, trying to measure how this varies with the resource, which again, I think is so crucial and something that we've talked about in the beginning, but I don't think we emphasized enough, and how for certain kinds of things, once again, berry picking, well, this little hands are not as bad at that. And so the disadvantage to little kids is not so great. And we would also see the little girls ending up with more to carry back to camp, and the little boys mostly feeding themselves and then going off doing their boying around. Am I better at getting those little birds than you? So we saw the differences early, and yes, the little girls very much attending to younger siblings and contributions to dinner. I can't remember, who was it that asked that? Was I responsive?
It's difficult to to see, because it's not a two-way thing, but that sounded a good answer. So I guess on that point, is there potentially, what is the link there between what younger people are doing as helpers and grandmothering? Is there, what evidence is there for knowledge being transferred from older people to younger people?
So I'm, and I'm going to expose my bias on this. I know that one of the things that people, depending on the kind of modeling you do, and I guess what you focus on in ethnography, who want to underline how important teaching is in human populations. And I have the same bias that a lot of ethnographers do of, really, not something that I think we see. I think what we see is little kids, oh, well, yeah, I want to be in that. What are you doing? Oh, yeah, is that okay? Is that how it works, etc. And that it's much more what's going on in the learning, and that the little kids want to be in it. And this is a thing developmental psychologists have emphasized. It's also part and relevant to the question you just asked, Tom. It is frequently said, famously, I believe, by Joe Hendrick, although he's probably quoting somebody, our grandmother libraries, that the issue is, Jared Diamond, I think, talked about this too, and other people have the idea that one of the reasons elders are useful is they remember stuff, and stuff that can be especially important during periods where things are changing and recent experience doesn't clue you into as much as if you have a longer time frame. And once again, my experience would not be consistent with that. I've actually seen people who are very high profile in the male hierarchy who are have trouble finding stuff because we haven't been to that place recently. And again, my reference to myself often and how much my memory of the old days is clouded by all kinds of recent experience. I'm skeptical of the argument that it's knowledge that's crucial, and one of the reasons, as in my talk, I underlined, it's economic productivity that is so visible in the case of the Hadza. And again, if you permitted to these savanna resources, is so crucial to whether or not it's going to work. And it has to be, you have to have, it's the basic economics. You got to be able, the kids have got to be able to eat every day, or this is a dead end. And the hunting is not going to cover that.
So that kind of feeds into the next question from somebody who is anonymous, but it relates to, I guess, this kind of issue of kind of the costs and benefits. So what is the efficiency of energy moving through grandmothers, given the energy needs of keeping grandmothers alive? So are grandmothers self-supporting? So I guess, but maybe more generally, given if there are costs to grandmothers, what are the benefits?
Well, good question, because there is a point at which, if you are still alive and you're this kind of animal, you become physically less capable. And one of the things that I regret about our Hadza ethnography was there was a very old lady in one of the places we were working, and she was old enough that instead of going off with the women and the kids who went off to dig together, she stayed near camp with kids who were near camp, and she would go with those kids. She was still foraging, even though she was, I think Nick finally estimated she was well into her 80s. So I think, and this of course is a thing that people have looked at in other places. I think Nancy Howell, who looked at this with Kung-speaking foragers around Gobi, and that ethnography is so rich in so many ways because of the ethnography done there, Richard V, and the things that he has recorded about complaint discourse and old people saying, and nobody ever takes care of me, and my son ignores me, and my daughter ignores me, and so on. And so that's so interesting. And then when it's possible to go back and look, and of course, it's a very self-serving story that the individuals are telling. And when there are photographs and other kinds of evidence showing it to be otherwise, of course there is a point at which efforts to keep that person alive are satisfying other needs than some kind of economic advantage. I think that's, whoever was asking the question, I think that is very likely to be true. But once again, we are not immortal. There is this thing about aging, and again, all of the stories that I am pulling together here are so consistent with basic life history theory about how, whether it's what the benefits of continuing to repair all of this to keep this thing going, because there's a trade-off between maintenance and repair and current reproduction, and what is the thing that selection is going to favor. And George Williams, who, as far as I'm concerned, was right about so much, had a paper all in the same year as his wonderful 66 book in American Naturalist, and something about an improvement on Lack's principle, in which he talked about those things, and how more repair is worth it if that repair means you're going to be there to give descendants later. These are things he talked about with other animals in his 57 paper, that really important contribution to life history theory and the wide variation we see in living things.
Okay, we've got another question. So from Burton again. So exploring more of this issue about kind of transmission of knowledge down generations. So saying that if tribal memory, or if passing on knowledge isn't so much about in terms of actual knowledge, might it be more related to more general things like ways of approaching situations, learned caution, ways of searching rather than remembering where things are, and so on. So I guess, are there these kind of more general patterns of behavior or learning, of potentially extending to learning of social norms or things like that that could be important?
I think I wouldn't have anything to add to that. It's possible. And then the question, well, I don't know. The question would be, what does that suggest a hypothesis that we could explore? And it would be, I guess, something about how does wisdom about social life come of age? I mean, one of the things about social relationships is how whatever's going on in the moment is something that can change so readily. And, the ethnography of foragers has increasingly shown this thing, and it was certainly true in the case of the Hadza that I've been focusing on, where who happens to be here right now in this residence group is actually quite fragile. And people do sometimes get crosswise with each other, or for some other reason, they then go somewhere else. And so, this voting with our feet kinds of pattern in which individuals are not, there's no reason for them to stay here except for the social relationships. There will be something about seasonality, which means certain places are probably better to be. One of the things that surprised me was sometimes we'd be in a camp with people who were exploiting a berry patch, and we have to walk so far to that berry patch, and there was another bunch of folks right near it, and I would say, why are we all the way back there? Or other kinds of times when, why are we so far from the water? Why don't we move closer? And the kinds of answers I would get was, well, I want to, it's her, or it's him, or it's, so these group decision processes, which those of us who serve on university committees know are mysterious as can be, are part of social life, in which some people have louder voices, some people get more attention. Once again, the evidence that shows things like hunting reputations, where you are in your social standing has consequences for the kind of influence you have. And those things are likely to, we can see that in other primates. It shouldn't surprise us that it would be a part of our own social armory.
So Pete has his hand up. So a rejoinder, Pete.
Okay. So Kristen, it's my impression that the bulk of the data that's available on the economics of hunting and gathering in living hunter-gatherers supports the hunting hypothesis pretty strongly. It's Kim Hill and Hilly Kaplan insist that the Hadza data that you present is misleading, and most of the groups, the bulk of the subsidy that flows from the to women to have those very short interbirth intervals comes from men's hunting. That they supply the surplus calories, and women by themselves barely support themselves. So the aggregated over the whole life history, the production of women women are specializing in producing kids, not calories. And of course, women forage, and that's very important. It couldn't happen any other way. And sure enough, sexual selection is important in humans as it is in lots of species. But the men are collaborating in these. There's a sort of a self-insurance scheme. Any man's chance of, even if he's a good hunter, of bringing home any meat on any given day is low. But when kills are made, the meat's widely shared, as you pointed out. And so the flow of meat to women and kids is fairly steady. It's not like tubers that don't run away. So I don't know, what do you think of this critique of your data and the review of the bulk of the data that suggests the hunting hypothesis has strong legs?
Well, as you probably know, Kim and Hilly were my students. It was actually Kim's Aceh connections that made that Aceh project possible. And what we learned from it was amazing, because these are foragers in eastern Paraguay, and they are so mobile in the forest, you know, rarely camping in the same place from one night to the next. And that mobility meant we could collect this huge quantitative data set, both on what people acquired and then whose stomachs it went into. You know, it's just really, it was an amazing opportunity. And Hilly's dissertation was focused especially on the sharing thing. And Hilly and I learned opposite things from his own analysis. So yeah, I think they are mistaken. I think they're, in the case of the Aceh, some of the striking features that were already right there, and this redounds in other foraging cases where the guys who are better hunters, I mean, one of the things they have wanted to argue is it's, you know, some version of reciprocal altruism, as you said, maybe some kind of insurance where, okay, I'm not successful today, but George is, and so my wife and kids take advantage of that. But one of the things that was so clear in the Aceh data was some guys are better hunters, they're more successful, and that is something that persists across years. The same guys are bringing in more, and they also spend more time at it. And they never get paid back in meat. It's the same way in the case of the Hadza. So, for example, and I've written about this. Brian Wood and Frank Marlowe wanted to push back on this argument about the Hadza, and so we pointed out the analysis of their data and our data, and the pattern that's so clear there. Some guys are actually supplying a lot to everybody, and they never, quote, get paid back, and the ones who never. So this is an odd insurance scheme. You don't ever have to buy a premium to get your losses covered. It's got all the fragility that if that were the thing that's running the show would not go on. My objection to Hilly's analysis, and this is a problem, of course, that we all have with observational data, is what time frame over which you average things. I mean, this is, if we use these simple foraging models, which have turned out to be useful for a lot of things, where the question is, is it worthwhile taking this resource that I've encountered, or should I continue searching for something better? And there's nothing in the models that says over what time frame am I likely to find something better. And if we average over years, or I don't know, even over quarters, or maybe even over months, if you get 1 meal a year, that's a lot. But what do you eat?
Is the audio dropped out for other people there too?
Oh, sorry.
I'm fine.
Just me.
So you didn't hear that rant? I am prone to them. I'm sorry.
Pete, can you just say something in a minute?
Yes, I'm test.
I can't hear anything.
Hey, Tom. This is Eric Carr. We can hear Kristen and Pete just fine.
So it's you, Tom. I wonder why you can't.
Sergey, you may have to take over duties.
Also, Kristen, these studies that have been done in the Hadza and the Aceh and considerable number of other groups, those have pretty large sample sizes, and in essence, they're trying to average over a lifetime. Kim argued to me once that the variation in hunting success is so great that he knows from his data who the best hunter is, but he didn't think that that people on the ground really could. And then they can distinguish between really crummy hunters and really good hunters. But among the good hunters, it's really hard to tell because he argued to me that injuries are really important. Hunting is pretty dangerous, and guys get hurt and laid up for long periods of time, in which case they're dependent upon the flow of resources from other hunters in the group. So it seems to me that the sort of self-insurance scheme is hypothesis is alive and well. Without a group of hunters, you couldn't afford to focus on big game, and big game or medium-sized game are really the most productive resources in these savanna environments. So I don't know. I'm pretty well convinced that the hunting hypothesis has legs. Not to argue that that sexual selection is not important in humans, but natural selection for would favor apparently men contributing to the support of women and kids on a large scale. What do you think of Van Schaik's what does he call it, the gray ceiling hypothesis, that without the contribution of men to subsidizing women and kids, we couldn't have a large brain like we have. That the whole life history revolves around male provisioning of offspring in women.
So, Carl is also somebody whose work has, influenced me. I respect him a lot, and I'm so disappointed in, he now has a textbook, and I keep trying to persuade him that there is an alternative view of the evidence. I don't know which ones of those to tackle. I think, Kim has a paper with Kintag saying you have to have samples that are way too big. Nobody can ever know. And yet, both in the case of the Aceh and in the case of the Hadza, people do know. They can nominate who the better hunters are. Not everybody can. I mean, one of the especially interesting things is, so Nick was collecting nominations, and the people that he asked that were the lousiest at it were the young girls. It's not, they, I mean, the older women knew, boy, were they watching, and the young men, and boy, this is it's like basketball teams. I mean, the attention that's paid by the males to who's better is very striking. And the notion that this is all run by female choice, which I know Sergey has argued, whoa, consider female choice, and then we get all this stuff going on. And once again, so this is a conversation I'd like to have with him, saying there are so many reasons that the data that are actually now in hand suggest something else is going on. And I think Kim and both Kim and Hilly about the arguments that it's the thing that runs the life history shift is that you need to, so Hilly has a formal model, some of you might know, of his embodied capital thing, how if you're very dependent and it takes a long time to learn to do something, but that pays off later in life, and you build a model, it doesn't have sexes in it, but you build a model then, but it's all about hunting, and then later in life you support the dependence. You can make a model that does that. I think the model has got the causal arrows in the wrong direction. And so, back to the initial influence of Charnov on my thinking about this broad variation across the mammals. You know, those elephants build these brains way bigger than ours, eating grass. I think the attention in the paleoanthropology to the question of caloric benefits has missed what is an especially important part of the story, and sexual selection is right at the heart of it. So yeah, you are picking out you're right, that you are in good company to be skeptical. And if we had time, it would be a welcome and useful exercise for me, maybe not for you, to go through, and I would show you why I am not persuaded by that, and how looking at so I think the gray ceiling story is on the wrong bus. Again, it's driving things from in the wrong direction. And I go back to Charnow, but now I've been so influenced by Barbara Finlay's work on mammalian brain size and the way you make this brain. And it's the duration of development that determines how big it is. And because the different components finish developing at different times, if you're building a mammal brain, the number of stem cell turnovers is different. I mean, the story that comes out of Finlay's work is amazing and very persuasive to me, that it's the longevity that drives the shift in brain size, as well as the longevity, you know, driving this shift in the sex ratio in the mating ages. And then you've got that slower developing brain and the earlier weaning. So here are these babies when mom's kind of gone on to the next one, and they are completely dependent. They are you know, motorically hopeless babies. But as Sarah Hurdy, so I'm standing on her work here, has argued, under those circumstances, selection for this social precociality is so strong, because if you don't attract attention and support, you're not going to be anybody's ancestor. So there is a story that is very counter to the hunting hypothesis, that stands on lines of evidence that come from lots of places. And that speaks to all the examples that you've given in the case of the Ache, in the case of the Hadza, and it's a counter to the Isler and von Schaik argument about the gray ceiling. But this is not very useful. And I think, and you think, and so the question is, how do we, I don't know. So for the broader audience, the issue I would hope is, well, there are alternative hypotheses out there. How can we move forward in ways that are is to, but actually show that some lines of evidence are more usefully interpreted in different ways. You guys, you're running this webinar. I hope it's a place where stuff like that is happening. So I'm sorry, Pete, I don't know how to give a better answer, except to say, I think if we sat down together and looked at the arguments, that you would be in good company, of course, but there is a very coherent argument that's consistent with the evidence that is different than the one you favor.
Okay, I won't say anything more. I've had my turn.
Let's get Monique in to ask her question, and then we'll come to Sergey.
Okay, briefly, hi Kristen, great talk. Nice to see you. I have the same concerns as Pete. I'm not going to repeat any of his points. I just want to bring it onto the sex ratio issue. A lot of your story is driven by this highly male biased sex ratio because of including all of the, the postmenopausal men and the postmenopausal women and men. If this sex ratio is so important, why don't we see mate guarding going on right into modern societies? Because we've got this same sex ratio now. And yet we see stable pair bonds and we see a lot of male paternal care. So I just don't get the logic of your argument here.
So I would say we do see it going on. And so I don't know whether you remember any of those papers. Margot Wilson was involved. There were lots of attempts to go at this question of what is going on with both pairing relationships and I guess mate choice in industrial societies and some Canadian examples. But so yeah, I do think the same thing is going on here. I think male hierarchies are a big deal, absolutely, and that plays such a big role in running the show. That boy, it's women, mothers of little kids who are so hammered by the COVID situation, and because of the way in which we pay the bills, it's very different from going out and digging up some tubers when you have a collection of other women and kids and so on, and are all going together, and we arrange this thing so differently with work in one place and home in another. And in cases where grandmother is there, I mean, people have looked at the effects of grandmothers on the welfare of their grandchildren with big data sets in societies like ours. And this question of mate guarding and what happens with all kinds of things, including domestic abuse, just a whole array of things about our social lives, where both the importance of the male hierarchy and the issues around maintaining pair bonds. I think one of the things that people are rediscovering is in the current circumstance, but it's been true or was true long ago that pair bonds can be very fragile. You know, going back again to the hunter-gatherer data sets, Nick pulled together a set of foraging examples where you knew something about this. We call this the divorce paper. We knew something about how long pair bonds were maintained. And, you know, it turns out that the predictor is how many other opportunities there are out there for the guys to get some more paternities. And so taking these four cases, the Ache, the Hiwi, the Hadza, and the Kun, the predictor is fertility units per male, about how, and the other ones simply don't. All the things that people want to say pair bonds are really about, it's about, I need the guy to support me and the kids, that other things are playing a really important role. So I don't think things are as different as you suggest, except they are. So now I'm going to be on both sides of that. In many of these ways that work so different, that all kinds of things with little kids are so different. You know, we now categorize them into ages, the preschoolers, right? And when in foraging societies, it's all these mixed age play groups. Pat Draper described that also beautifully. We live in a kind of socioecology with really different opportunities and constraints and costs and benefits, and they have effects. I think often the effects are terrifying, and the fact that pair bond is so important, it has to do everything. And if, you know, it's mostly aspirational, this notion of isolated nuclear families, but to the extent that's the case, then both the mom and dad and the kids, it's these relationships, everything hangs on them. And in foraging communities, that's just, you're not getting along with mom, there are all kinds of other women, and you're not getting along with dad, there are all kinds of other men, or these kids. I mean, the particular relationships don't carry the same load that they do in our socioecology. But you know, I think the politics around us just show the male hierarchy is hugely effective. And young men, the bachelor threat, Lars Brodseth really put this together so persuasively, looking at broad ethnographic patterns. So yeah, you and I should sit down over a bottle of wine and talk about this movie.
Well, I mean, I accept that obviously these things are going on, you know, and across the anthropological record we see it, but also there are a huge number of males who spend a huge amount of time looking after offspring.
Right.
I think my connection went.
Yeah, no, but I did hear you. You said there are, and you know, of course, you know, I am in print on this, watching these warm relationships between Hadza men and their kids, you know, very warm relationship. So I'm not disputing any of that, but when it comes to paying the daily bills of that kid has to be taken care of right now all day. It is the case that some men are doing that, but you know, it's a tiny fraction of, and it's tricky to manage to pull that off.
Okay, Monique looked frozen there, so I think we'll move on to Sergey's question. No, Sergey's okay. I'll move on to, there's a couple of questions which I think tap into this question around kind of operational sex ratio and mate guarding. So we see these things in other species too. Yeah. So I guess one question is kind of, do you think that operational sex ratio is insufficient to motivate male competition via display without the effect of menopause? And I guess another related question is why humans does it have this effect? And then maybe not other species. So gorillas also have a you know, male biased operational sex ratio, I would imagine, but they don't have.
I think it's really hard to do demography on gorillas because of, you know, who you actually include. It's one of the reasons that we usually privilege because the data are better. But yeah, I mean, it is a thing across the primates when you actually have the data, you can see that usually the local group is very female biased. Anyway, so that's very different in the fertile ages. But so let's see, the question was absolutely this thing. Well, first of all, you know, for those of you who are into these issues, it has come to be a distinction of use to separate what's called the operational sex ratio, which is, you know, those individuals who are ready for a conception right now. And that is always in mammals, male bias, just because females get committed, you know, okay, now I'm pregnant, so I'm gestating, and then I'm going to be lactating, so I'm not in the mating pool. The operational sex ratio and the adult sex ratio, that's the technical term in biology, the adult sex ratio, but it's actually the ratio of adults in the fertile ages. And in fact, there was a recent paper, Fromage and Genus, or Genus and Fromage, I forget, who were, you know, pointing out the errors in this very influential 2008 paper of Coco and Genus, but actually commenting on, and we're ignoring any case where there's anything like menopause. I just wanted to say, okay. But let's see. So the question was, yes, absolutely. Well, the whole idea of operational sex ratio, you know, as you know, comes from behavioral ecology. It had nothing to do with humans. Interest in the adult sex ratio comes from biology generally. I mean, it was really the striking thing for avian biologists to begin to see that in the cases where you have what's called sex role reversal, in which this is rampant in shorebirds, where females seem to be competing with each other for males who then sit on the nest. And that is called sex role reversal because of this standard story that males compete and females care, but that what lies behind that in the shorebirds is the sex rate, the adult sex ratio, the sex ratio in adulthood. And again, adulthood is assumed, because this is true of most living things, all of adulthood is spent being, you know, producing offspring. I have a particular interest in Fischer recognizing the effects of grandmothers in us, and yet ignoring it on the next page. So he has pointed that out, and yet we get a standard Fischerian treatment in which reproductive value in the postmenopausal ages is 0, and therefore there shouldn't be any of us. And so again, let's see, am I losing the thread here, Tom? It was actually Jeff Parker, who has been this amazing student of dung flies, who in a sense was the first guy to because he was really paying attention to what these dung flies were doing, to seeing that whether or not a male stays longer in copula depends on the competition, how many males there are out there. And because he started to put all of these pieces together, it turned out that these dung flies are doing things that you just, I mean, they're goddamn dung flies, you know, I'm not even sure they have a neuron. And yet this very responsive behavior given the socio-ecological context. So Jeff Parker and his understanding why anisogamy, why we get that disruption in these two gamete types, and his arguments about the sexual cascade, he's the master and has supplied so much of what we understand this broader regularity. And so no question, this is something that has come to be understood generally in other animals, and which is why I, as a behavioral ecologist, I'm always objecting to my colleagues who want to talk about what they call human behavioral ecology, because I think the tools of behavioral ecology, you can't even know how to use them unless you're looking more broadly at the much wider variation. And that's when people have used tools from Darwin to, you know, he was already seeing that, wow, we can explain this dazzling variety, that using the tools, and because he didn't understand inheritance, then we had what happened at the early part of the 20th century, all of this, oh, is it genes? No, it's natural selection. No, it's gene, you know, all that craziness. And it wasn't until Fischer putting those pieces together that that the track changed. And then, well, sorry.
I'm just no, I think that's it's good. So your response would be that, yeah, you see operational sex ratio as the key to it all, even without menopause.
Yeah, well, and I was distinguishing these things: operational sex ratio and adult sex ratio. They're different. And in our 2015 paper, you know, we calculate both, talk about reasons, talk about some of this history, although it's, you know, always compressed. And this is the problem with current publication, where it's assertion, citation, assertion. Unless you know the literature, you don't even know, wait, what are they saying? And I don't think we have a solution to that. But a thing that I think is necessary is to be in the same conversation, which is why what you're doing, you know, having these webinars is so important, where opportunities for people to see and hear and try to understand alternative views of what's going on. And then, of course, there are so many interesting questions. I'm obsessed by some about how we got to be this animal. But I know there are lots of other, you know, interesting questions, and that other people are obsessed by. And I always learn if I hear what they're saying, which is often tricky.
I think on that note, we'll have to draw. As you can probably tell from the glow from my screen, it's getting dark here in Britain. So I think myself and all the panelists would like to thank you again, Kristen, for a stimulating talk and discussion. And just to say, Sergey, do you want to say anything? That's fine. Oh, his microphone is off. I'm sure he's.
Yeah. Thanks again, Kristen. Wonderful talk. Thank you. And for everybody else, we may have a change in schedule next week. We'll send an email if this indeed happens. Eric, you want to say something?
The previous talks are all up on YouTube. It will be a couple extra days to get Kristen's up, but it should be up by the end of the week as well. And thank you for your talk.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks all. Cheers.
See you next week.
And with that, I will end the seminar. Have a great week. Bye.
Stay well, everybody.
You too.